Right. For example, we worked with Clinton Hill Apartments. They installed some microturbines in their basement. It's in Brooklyn, so I wish the other members were here. And they had to put in on each individual building protective relays, reverse power protective relays to prevent any power from going back to the grid in Con Ed territory.
They had to make sure it didn't go back.
Yeah, it has to do with how Con Ed's network is set up. They have what they call a double contingent network. So on large buildings, there are transformer vaults, and those transformer vaults have what they call network protectors, which are somewhat of one-way valves into the building, if you will, or a check valve into the building. So those don't allow reverse power. So part of the requirement when you put in smaller cogeneration systems is to limit it to only a net positive into the building. Con Ed could change those rules. They could, those network protectors are adjustable. They could allow some reverse current. We had to do that in some cases at One World Trade Center because the elevators were causing the network protectors to trip because the elevators on certain, they regenerate, they're regenerative, so on the braking, they regenerate power back into the network, and it was causing some spikes to
I mean, it just
trip,
seems on an overall basis that's a better way to go long term. I don't know whether the system has the capacity, the lines, what have you.
They definitely have the
capacity. It just seems like on the, in terms of the overall system. Now, as far as net metering goes, you hear for, Audrey's testimony, that's not the way, they look to go. I do, and having already had one bill vetoed when I tried to add fuel cells, the claim being that, fuel cells are not intermittent, which, CHP is not intermittent either, I would expect a veto. So although I'm very sympathetic, and in fact, there is a bill in my committee that would add commercial and large scale, and I like it very much. Now, I do know that at the end of the day, it's likely that we'd get a veto for the same reason. So not that I'm not willing to entertain that, I just don't know that it's, that productive in terms of trying to get it done, that's all.
I'm using the term net metering, but frankly, it could also be some other mechanism
I understand.
through
and
REV
that's what I think I'm going to try to pursue.
That recognizes the value, because really there's actually currently a tremendous amount of installed capacity particularly in New York City, whose value to the grid is not being realized right now.
Well, it just seems like a one-way system doesn't make sense. Not the performance thing for steam doesn't make sense. For the same goals that we're trying to achieve, that's so those seem easier.
Right.
So I don't have any other questions.
Yeah, a question to Mr. Skolasky. We heard earlier that upstate has very little combined heat and power, or National Grid very little combined heat and power. My question is, why is it that in downstate, in Con Ed, we do have so much combined heat and power? We've got companies, developers in upstate who boast about having LEED certified buildings, and they're trying to do the right thing. Is it because, and I'll let you answer the question, but is it because of Con Ed providing steam that gets steam into the mix in building? Why the difference between city and upstate?
Before we get to Con Ed, it may also have to do with when you size cogeneration, there's two constraints. One obviously is how much electric you could use, and if you can send it back, which you can't at this point, unless you're really, really large. Again, even our 4.6 megawatt power plant has in the interconnect agreement, we're connected on the high tension side, and we're not allowed to send in. We do send it back into the grid, but it wheels, as Con Ed was talking about earlier. But we can't send more out than we use. So thankfully, we have a pretty big base load in One Bryant Park because of our tenant and their use. They have a pretty large load. So we keep that cogen runs at 100% around the clock. But if our demand of our building were to drop, we have to drop with it. So we don't do that right now. But I would say that's one constraint. The other constraint is your thermal constraint. You don't want to overbuild. Even if you could use all the electricity, you don't want to overbuild because then you're going to be sending the heat out and you're going to be running at a less efficient means. So I think some of it has to do with how much heat, how much thermal They can use that usually for us when we're sizing cogen plants usually becomes more of a limiting factor of when you can use it and what do you do with it in the summertime. You know, we run ours through an absorption chiller to make chilled water. How much of it can you run through an absorption chiller, and does it become worth it? There's a point of de minimis return where you get too big for what you can use just for a peak day. So that becomes an issue. I think another issue is, again, on the thermal side, if your building is supplied with steam, you automatically, the minute you connect something to that, you either have to take the load off the steam system and keep it off at all times, which would mean you'd have to have another means to back up that heat load, whether it be electric or gas, or you end up paying standby charge on the entire capacity of the building. One of the studies we're actually doing right now is down at World Trade Center. We had fuel cells that were part of going in the building. They were flooded out during Sandy. We're looking for other means or other alternatives there. But one of the big problems before Superstorm Sandy hit was those fuel cells made about 5,000 pounds of steam an hour. Yet they were being put onto a building that had an 80,000 pound contract demand. So again, ours is 40 at One Bryant Park. At World Trade Center, the standby charge would have been over $2 million alone, just for those 5 M-pounds, just because of the way the standby tariff is written. And, you know, there was a discussion that we had with Con Ed, and they allowed us to we came up with a solution to bifurcate the steam system, but that meant having 2 separate metering systems for Con Ed, basically 2 separate steam services to the building, one at 5,000 pounds just to back up the cogen, and that would have been on the standby tariff. And then the rest was at a firm rate for the rest of the building. The problem with that is now it was another $1 million upfront cost just to bifurcate the steam system. So it starts getting complicated, starts eating into the payback of these systems. They're not making that much energy, and what you're getting paid or what you're offsetting doesn't make up for the large capital cost.
And let me just interject here. So as part of NETP, we're a whole the Northeast group. We support more transparency in regards to interconnection processes throughout the state. We think a quarterly report that's just filed at the PSC is not transparent enough for our members, and we'd like to see some suggestion to bring that down to maybe a monthly report that's posted on each individual utility so that the developers of CHP in New York State can see exactly what the interconnection process is, what the potential barriers are, and how those can be overcome.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just clarify, my staff reminded me that in the fuel cell bill, we also included CHP, so both were vetoed. So we've already been there, done that. Just one small question. I mean, in most commercial property in Manhattan, utilities are included in the rent, right? I mean, for tenants? I probably should ask my husband.
In rentals, the utilities for heat are typically included in the rent. Electric is either typically direct metered or sub-metered.
I see.
It's sub-metered under the Public Service Commission guidelines.
I see. So in order to be competitive rent-wise, which you have to be in the market to get a tenant, you know, that's the piece that you would need to incorporate in order to make CHP make sense, because it's heat.
Yes.
You know, because the other is...
Because typically, as a landlord, we are required, heating is a requirement to sell an apartment.
Well, for a resident.
It's a requirement. So
Also
we pay for it as the
The
landlord.
commercial tenants are similar,
Commercial tenants, typically on commercial office tenants, yes, heat is included in the rent,
but not electric.
not electric.
Got it. Okay.
And there's New York City bills that require sub-metering, I guess by 2025, I think it is, for local law 88. That really trying to encourage more sub-metering of each individual office.
And in commercial buildings, we typically don't charge a premium for electric to tenants. We don't want to be a utility. We're a landlord. We provide Class A office space. We charge rent for that Class A office space. We don't want to hammer our tenants with electric charges. We could if we wanted to, but we don't want to. And we charge basically what we get charged. We just pass it forward. So we rebill them based on their meter use at an SC9 large customer rate, even if they're only a 5,000 square foot tenant.
Right. Right.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're
Yeah.
welcome. Thank you.
Very good.
And our last panel, solar. You guys come up.
And you guys include, we
Dr.
understand.
Bryce Smith
Yes, Bryce Smith.
and Timothy Carr.
Bryce Smith is the Associate Professor of Physics at SUNY Cortland and consultant to the New York State Energy Industry Association, NYSEA. Tim Carr is Key Account Manager for Monolith Solar Associates.
Preference on order.
Dr. Smith and Mr. Carr.
Good afternoon.
Great. So just wanted to start by thanking you again for the opportunity to talk to you today about this important topic. As you mentioned, I'm a professor of physics at SUNY Cortland and direct our graduate energy program in sustainable energy. And I work pro bono as a consultant for the New York Solar Energy Industries Association. And I see as a statewide membership and trade organization dedicated to advancing solar energy use across New York State. And it's led by a diverse board of directors with companies of all sizes across the state who seek to accelerate the responsible and sustainable development of renewable energy and to bring jobs that benefit the communities while reducing the environmental impacts of our energy system. We strongly support that a robust, transparent, and efficient interconnection process, and that is critical to New York's ability to meet its renewable energy goals. All parties to the interconnection process share the same overarching goal of providing safe, reliable electricity while accelerating the more efficient and cost-effective interconnection of renewable energy sources. And it is in the balancing of these two goals where the ongoing improvements have the greatest potential to accelerate the development of renewable energy and to increase its access for all customers. As has been mentioned earlier, over the last year and a half, a number of very significant improvements have been undertaken in the interconnection process, the most significant of which was the March 2016 update to the standard interconnection process, which for the first time adopted a standardized set of screening methodologies in New York. The screening methodologies allow for a common set of conservative conditions to be tested, and if met, this makes the systems very unlikely to have negative impacts on the grid, allowing them to go directly to an interconnection contract. This saves time, money, and utility effort from having to study systems in a detailed engineering study when they're really not necessary to happen. In addition, as was mentioned earlier, the addition of binding timelines for developers, where if you fail to respond within a timely fashion, your application is removed from the interconnection queue, is a major advance because it can help prevent dormant projects from blocking the pathway to interconnection for those projects that come behind them. The other significant improvements that have been mentioned, the creation of the ombudspersons persons in both DPS and NYSERDA, as well as the appointment of a specific ombudsperson person in each of the utilities to help alleviate and mediate those concerns. In addition, DPS has also formed a statewide interconnection technical working group that is chaired by themselves and NYSERDA and includes members of all the investor-owned utilities, NYSEA, and some of the larger solar developers. This group is designed to help improve the transparency and consistency of technical standards across the state and to help with the adoption of best practices, as well as improve upon the communication and collaboration between utilities and developers that was mentioned earlier. Now, while there remains many aspects of the interconnection process that is now just a few days old, it went live on April 29th, that still have to be worked out, these improvements really have been a huge step forward. Despite this big step, there are a few really important issues that still are on the table, three of which NYSEA views as the most urgent and critical to address. The first has been talked briefly about, which is the lack of a formal interconnection queue management process. The queue as of April 1st was 2,900 megawatts worth of solar. This is roughly more than 6 times what is already interconnected to the grid and nearly twice the now suspended net metering caps. This large interconnection queue and the resulting stress that it has put on the utilities' ability to process these applications, as well as creating policy considerations being driven by the realization that there's this very large number of solar that's there, the most significant of which is perhaps the valuation of solar changes that are coming to net metering. The size of the interconnection queue, though, is unlikely to be a good measure of how much solar is actually under development. To date, there were limited timelines, as was mentioned, so that the developers could have projects that lie dormant for up to a year within the process, and even then they only might be removed from the queue, not necessarily were removed from the queue. More significantly, though, until the new SIR went live, there was no way for any developer to know the technical characteristics of the lines to which they were attempting to connect without submitting an application. As a result, developers often submitted multiple applications for the same project, seeking to identify a site where interconnection was viable. The other applications, therefore, remained in the queue. And having a requirement from some of the utilities that the customer has to sign off to get them removed from the queue, that has helped create some barriers to being able to flush out some of these old projects. There was also no requirement for the application stage that you actually had to have any type of site control for the site you were applying for, which led to the potential for speculation and adding projects that may not be real. So NYSEA strongly supports the process that has been started by the ombudspersons to create a formal interconnection queue management process, and recommends strongly to its own members the use of the new pre-application report, which is designed to allow you to learn about the circuits without having to apply for an application and put yourself into the interconnection queue. It is particularly important that this has a couple of elements, namely site control before you can file for an application, binding timelines for every stage of the process, and some mechanism to deal with the large number of projects that are subject to the old process where the timelines were not binding. This is important to the overall functioning of the interconnection process because those new screens that have been put in place, those dormant projects are showing up in the screening calculations whether or not they will actually show up in the real world, therefore leading systems that could otherwise avoid detailed study to have to require them because of the apparent number of other projects trying to interconnect to that same line. The second issue is while the binding timelines for developers are certainly a significant improvement, as was noted, there are currently no formal enforcement mechanisms for the utilities to meet the timelines within the SIR, and no formal dispute resolution process under the SIR as well. As you've noted, there have been concerns with utilities not meeting these timelines, driven in part by these periodic spikes, they called it the surge in these applications, when there are regulatory changes such as the authorization of community distributed energy. Now, while the new ombudspersons are certainly an important help, there are no current specific metrics to which the utilities will be held, no frequency for how often that will be evaluated, and other types of processes that could be used for performance metrics. NYSEA recommends that in the near term, New York seriously look at adopting a timeline enforcement mechanism similar to what Massachusetts put in place back in June of 2014, which looks at a weighted average of the actual time to interconnection versus the timelines allowed within their version of the interconnection rules. With respect to dispute resolution, there has been a formal request to the PSC to reopen the SIR update proceeding to consider the addition of a dispute resolution process. And we recommend that New York look to systems like was put in place in Minnesota, where they appoint an independent engineer in the case of a dispute between the utilities and a developer who has the formal binding capacity to mediate that technical discussion between those two and to make a decision that's binding on both parties. Finally, we note that within the Reforming Energy Vision proceedings, there are discussions of these enforcement mechanisms, these earning impact mechanisms, performance-based regulations, one of the 5 of which was interconnection. The EIMs are going to be a larger discussion than just the timelines. They're going to look at utility efforts for cost-effective interconnection and capacity building within the utilities, and therefore we view them as complementary to a timeline enforcement mechanism within the SIR and not as necessarily a replacement for them. The third barrier to interconnecting new net metered projects is the lack of cost-sharing mechanisms. As was noted earlier, the current interconnection process is a first mover pays all for the upgrades to the distribution system, and this is irrespective of whether the upgrades benefit that one project alone or whether those upgrades will open up significant new capacity for projects behind them to interconnect. There are a number of substations that are currently already bottlenecked around the state where they need one of these high-cost upgrades. No one wants to be that first mover on those upgrades. And so finding some mechanism to pay for these upgrades outside of the first mover pays all would be a significant benefit. In California, they started this process with passage of the Assembly Bill 327, which authorized the formation of their distribution resource planning, very similar to what REV has started in New York with the distributed systems integration plans, the DSIPs. As mentioned in New York, those are due, the first iterations are due at the end of June. Within that process, in California, they began to look at how to make circuits solar ready, renewable ready, where you could also make benefits to the rest of the grid. So locational benefits like we've heard, where you have perhaps upgrades that could be delayed. And those are benefits that are both for the solar developers, but for the larger ratepayers. And they're looking at mechanisms to rate base those kind of upgrades. Telemetry and the monitoring of the grid was another example from California. While the DSIPs are being considered and those kind of larger mechanisms are under consideration, at least within the SIR, having the ability to cost share between developers so that if you have a collection of projects waiting on a substation upgrade, you could pool those costs across multiple solar developers. That alone would be a huge first step that could open up a lot of room for new net metered customers to be able to access the grid. So I thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you today. We look forward to continuing to work with all parties to improve the interconnection process.
Thank you. My name is Tim Carr. I'm with Monolith Solar. It's a great opportunity to be here today. Thank you to Chairperson Pollen and Chairperson Schimminger for having us have the opportunity to discuss this topic of solar interconnection in New York State. So our company, we develop and install solar projects all across New York State. And it's really been a tremendous journey for us considering the amazing growth in solar that we have in New York State. If you look on NYSERDA's website, you'll see that in 2003, there were 36 solar installations in New York State, across the whole state, the early adopters. If you look on that same website, in 2015, there were over 16,000 installations. In the first 4 months of this year, 2016, there's been over 7,500. So we're well on track to be over 21,000 solar installations statewide by the end of this year. It's very exciting. And as I'm sure you all see when you drive around neighborhoods across New York State, I certainly know when I drive home from work, more and more people are putting solar on their rooftops. It's really exciting. And every one of those people is helping us reach the governor's goals of 50% renewables by 2030. So it's very exciting. And what's also very clear is that the ratepayers have spoken. They have said what they want, and they want renewables. The other really amazing thing about this industry is the job growth. Renewable energy represents one of the fastest growing job opportunity markets across the nation. New York State happens to be the 4th largest solar job market in the United States. We have over 8,000 solar jobs. So again, it's very exciting to see it. We're expecting double-digit job growth in 2016 alone. So our company, in the end of 2014, we began developing solar farms. So these are remote systems. They're based on New York State's remote net metering policy. We invested heavily in operations, in equipment, in personnel. We invested in expanding our geography from border to border in New York State. We also hit the street, so to speak, and the ratepayers spoke. We have today over 70 megawatts of contracted commitments with ratepayers across New York State. These ratepayers are largely represented by school districts, by municipalities, nonprofits, colleges, and commercial entities, again, statewide. So our company, since 2014, we have the ability to install 2 megawatts in aggregate per month very easily. We certainly can do it. And the way that we do this is we build 200 kilowatt sites. So every site that we operate on we're installing 200 kilowatts. And I actually brought some pictures. I wanted to show you guys kind of the scope of a 200 kilowatt system. So, and it's also in the handout. So if you look in page 8, you can see a picture of one of these systems. I'm just going to flip to it really, really quick. So this is a 200 kilowatt system. It's about 650 solar panels. It takes up all of an acre of land. 200 kilowatts is 10% of the previous SIR's interconnection limit of 2 megawatts. It's 4% of the now 5 megawatt limit. So very small in size, particularly when you look at the amount of land in New York State and you look at the electrical consumption here. So small systems. A system of this size generates enough electricity for about 20 households per year. So we have the ability, one of our crews, to install this system in about 14 days. So if we were to start a 200 kilowatt system today on May 6th, we would be done by Memorial Day. So shedding some light on the utilities' involvement in this same 200 kilowatt system. So as has been previously mentioned, they have 15 days to respond to an initial request or an initial interconnection application. So provided that we start today on May 6th, we'll know by the end of May what we can do, and we'll get one of two responses from the utility. It'll either be, you guys can go ahead and interconnect the system, or a Caesar study is required. A Caesar study is basically a feasibility analysis so that the grid can understand its own grid. It can understand the capacity, the equipment, the light loading that's at that location, and we pay for it, and the grid does it on their own grid. So for a 200 kilowatt system, 4%, which is 4% of the size of the current limit of 5 megawatts, a very small system. This charge can be upwards of $10,000. We then wait 60 business days to hear from the utility. So now we're basically into August for something that we can build by Memorial Day. At that time, we get to the point where we can move forward. We also have interconnection cost. For a typical system of this size, what we're experiencing is interconnection cost of around $40,000. So by the end of this process, we've spent $50,000, which is about 20% of the cost of what it actually cost us to build this system. So the best part is that the utilities get to keep that initial $10,000 for the study no matter what happens. So the point that I want to illustrate here is that is if the utilities respond within the timeframes allotted. I can tell you that in certain utility territories, our current projects, 95% of them are in some form of delay. Either a delay on the initial application or a delay in hearing back on the Caesar. So best case is 4 months from now. So for us, we have 70 megawatts to build. We have 50% renewables we're trying to hit. We have 600% growth in solar since 2012. Is this what ratepayers want? Do they want to wait 6 months to have a system commission, something that we can build very easily in 2 or 3 weeks? Our initial strategy when we started doing solar farms was actually not to do 200 kilowatt systems. Our initial strategy was to do larger systems because, again, PSC policy supports doing that. However, we stopped doing that, and the reason is this. Our first 4 applications for larger farms, these were 600 kilowatts in size, so a little bit larger, still not very large. After waiting a year, we still didn't have the projects commissioned. A year that our customers were waiting for their system to be online. A year that we waited, and also when the utility imposed fees to both study and interconnect the system of anywhere between $200,000 and $400,000 for each one of those projects. Thankfully, we reached out to our Public Service Commission, and we have to thank Mike Warden, Elizabeth Grozaru, and Jason Pazzi from the PSC who stepped in, and because of their due diligence and their efforts, we were able to get those systems online, 3 out of the 4 of them. And interestingly enough, we were able to drive down the cost from $400,000 to $4,000. So as I mentioned previously, we have the ability to install 2 megawatts per month right now, and we're planning on growing. We have 70 megawatts to build. It's very exciting. So if you look at the past 18 months, which is, again, we started developing solar farms in late 2014, so it's been about 18 months. We have had the ability to install 130 200-kilowatt systems, 30 megawatts across New York State. We can very easily do it. We have the contracts to support it. 30 megawatts represents approximately $1.5 million in savings to ratepayers across New York State. Again, school districts, municipalities, commercial entities, colleges across New York State. $1.5 million is the actual value that we had the ability to generate. But we didn't interconnect 30 megawatts over the past 18 months. We didn't interconnect 150 systems. We interconnected 14. We completed 2 megawatts of projects, which is somewhere around 3 or 4% of what we have to do. So the other challenge that we face after those projects were interconnected, and we're still addressing, is our customers actually, or the off-takers, getting credits for the systems that we've installed. One of the first 600 kilowatt systems that I mentioned, I'm actually going to show you a picture of it really quickly. This is for a municipal off-taker, and interestingly enough, we didn't quite plan this, but as you can see, if you inflect this image, it's actually in the shape of New York State. This system has been online partially since November of last year. The municipal customer still is not receiving the right crediting. We have another system, which I'll show you. This is for a city government in upstate New York. They have received 0 crediting for the system that was interconnected in December of 2015. So there are a number of challenges that we're facing here. We're facing delays, and we're facing the situation where our customers are not receiving the credits that they have committed to and that they're eligible for. And this is because of a consistent pattern of resistance that we are experiencing from the utilities to abide by PSC policies that are in place. And really the question for us comes back to, what does the ratepayer want? At the current pace of the utilities' responsiveness to our projects, it will take just our company to do our portfolio 30 years to complete these projects for school districts, municipalities, and commercial entities across New York State. My 2-year-old son will be older than I am today by the time these projects will be interconnected at the current pace. So there is another element to this that I'd like to bring up, and that is that these projects were contracted for monetary crediting under remote net metering. Monetary crediting under the current PSC law is slated to expire in December of 2017. So we would like to request that New York State lawmakers step in and help us extend that deadline, because clearly we have quite an uphill time frame to work with as far as the utilities. So we would like to request that that extension be made from 2017 to 2021 to give us the time to deliver for the ratepayers and the contracts we have. That also models in years the extension of the investment tax credit that Congress passed last year. One of the other things that we'd like to look at is the current SIR recommends that projects under 300 kVA in size go on an expedited track for review. The language says encouraged. We would like to request that all projects under 300 kVA go on an expedited track. And on a more holistic level, we would like to work with New York lawmakers, the utilities, and all to make it so that the interconnection process from application to permission to operate is 30 days. We believe that that's a goal that we need to reach, especially when you see the job growth, you see that the ratepayers want it, you see the environmental initiatives and the targets that we have, and those are very important things that we meet, and there's a lot at stake. So the last thing I'll say is I hope you will consider these comments and And again, it's about what the ratepayers want. So thank you again.
Thank you. No.
So just quickly, Massachusetts, and Minnesota, those two models, for holding the utilities accountable, was that after a similar kind of a proceeding where the the timelines and the information that was requested was very transparent? I mean, which is what this order is supposed to do?
It was after they adopted a similar screening methodology. The screening methodology that New York adopted is very similar to one that started in California and then was adopted by FERC in 2013. And since then, Minnesota, Massachusetts, a number of other states have adopted models that are very similar to that. So once those timelines were created, it was then recognized that the next logical step was the timeline enforcement mechanism. And for Massachusetts, that followed about a year or two later.
Both of them were also done through their Public Service Commission, not through legislation, I assume.
Yeah, the dispute resolution and the timeline enforcement mechanisms were both regulatory for those states.
I guess it's just a matter of when, it seems like, right? The question is, the question for me, anyway, I mean, Audrey clearly said that, this is a first step and they're going to monitor, which is your first point, when, how and when are they going to monitor? So, and I want to ask you a question related to that, but they indicated that this might be a second step, but only if they do your first point, which is to monitor. So how does monitoring happen? For example, how do they know? I mean, I asked the question, there were 9,000 projects, you're saying 2,900, megawatts of, which is probably those 9,000 projects. Is the timeline when you're doing a project? Do you report in? How do they know where it is and that there are 9,000 and that they're not moving in the way they're supposed to move? Like, how is anybody going to know?
I mean, that's certainly an important point. And how Massachusetts dealt with that was in the reporting of the interconnection queue, which is, as I think was mentioned earlier, it's quarterly in New York. It happens more frequently in other states. That they use that same process to track sort of the time since the initial application. And the enforcement mechanism that Massachusetts uses, they do have 3 tracks. They have the fast track for the smallest systems, the residential scale systems. They have an expedited process, and then they have their full process. And they use a weighted average. I think it's 20% for the fast ones, 40% of their metric is for the expedited, and 40% is for the more complicated projects. And they look at strictly timeline. They say how many days since application to interconnection to the signed contract, and then they take a ratio of that to the days. And if you
so they don't know which part of it necessarily. They just know that there was a delay, and you can tell by that, I'm sure, whether there's a cumulative problem in one utility or a problem, and then you could look at it further, I guess, if it's
right. Exactly.
Right.
And for them, they then impose financial penalties.
Right.
If you exceed the cap, if you exceed the regulated timelines by more than 5%, then you begin to pay a penalty that goes up to something roughly equivalent to the total pool of application money that you have received. So all of the monies that were talked about that you pay in for the studies and the supplemental review and the CSER studies, that pool of money is at risk under the Massachusetts standard.
And the Minnesota model of hiring this outside engineer, that's outside of the Public Service Commission? They just hire some guy? I mean,
it's a formal dispute resolution process that their version of the Public Utilities Commission has created, which is that if you apply to the dispute resolution process, if you have a technical issue that you can't resolve, Then there is the appointment by the Public Service Commission of an independent engineer. The costs are shared between the developer and the utility, and they mediate the process. So it used to be that the engineer was selected by the utility, and I believe in its latest incarnation, it's actually selected by their PUC.
So I would love to see copies of, if you have them handy, otherwise we can certainly look them up. Of Massachusetts and Minnesota are very intriguing. You
Yes.
know, good summer reading.
Yes, no, I have them all on my computer. I'll be happy to send them to
Yeah.
you. So.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We enjoyed. Fini. Done.
Done, we're done.
Have
Everybody
some
go
lunch.
home.